No swearing today. No effing and jeffing. Today is all about going back 30, 38 years ago. May the 11th, 1985. Now, the city I'm from back in the UK, for them that don't know, is a city called Bradford. Now, I'm not. I've put down Bradford a lot in the past, and before everybody starts writing in the people that live there and start giving me grief, the place just didn't work for me, so that's why I left. But the one time that I really remember everybody pulling together as one in that city was the days following the 11th of May, 1985. Now, you you ask anybody of a certain age from that town, wherever you may be around the world, what's the significant day in the city of Bradford's calendar? And within a flash, they'll say the 11th of May. The 11th of May is when the entire city will come together and remember. And it doesn't matter if you're white or you're Asian. I mean, all that grief that's gone on between those two factions in the past, all that's forgotten, at least for that one day. And it's a beautiful thing. It really is. Now, what I will say to you is now I've just said that the Bradford people will say to you the 11th of May. It's just like the people of Rangers, the fans of Rangers, they will go 2nd of January 71 when they had their stadium disaster. The Juve fans, that Champions League final in Belgium, they'll say 29th of May 85, which were only 2.5 weeks after the Bradford disaster. And then you can turn to a Liverpool fan. A Liverpool fan will go 15th of April 89. Yeah, Hillsborough. So with Bradford, it's the 11th of May. And that date is, in some cases, well, it is. For that city, it's more important than Christmas. More important than Christmas to just stop and have a minute. Just stop and have a minute. Now, for them of you not in the know, there were a huge fire at a football game. Huge fire. And it was horrific. Now, let me just give you the history of it before we get into the nuts and bolts. Now, for them who have never visited my hometown, if you go to the city centre, wherever you turn, all points from the compass, whichever way you walk out of that city centre from town hall, you are going uphill. You are going uphill. They put the town hall in a valley, and everywhere from that town hall you are going up. You've got a steady climb in some parts, especially if you're going up Thornton Road, but you are going up. Manchester Road is just a steady climb until you get to Odsall, and then you go down the other side. Church Bank is probably the steepest. I've got it's nigh on mountaineering in some places, but it's all uphill. I remember in the early 70s when I was a kid, I used to get dragged round town by my mother, going shopping for this and shopping for that. And I remember it had rained really heavy for a good few days, and we couldn't go into the city centre because all the subways had flooded, because the city centre is in the lowest part of Bradford. So that's kind of the geography of my hometown. Now, the stadium, Valley Parade, is about a 2 mile walk, mile and a half, 2 mile walk from city centre. So you kind of go up an hill and then you go on to Manningham Lane and you walk along Manningham Lane. Now, as you are walking along Manningham Lane, there is a right turn. And then you drop down to Valley Parade where the stadium is. You turn down a street called Valley Parade and the stadium is halfway down that road. Now, the stadium is built into the side of a hill. So the stadium the stand that's set on fire back then is the stand that you would walk into if you were coming down from Valley Parade. It's the one that you could see the back of. So it's built into an hill. So as you walk, or as you walked into that old stand pre-85, pre-May 85, as you walked into that stand through those gates on Valley Parade, once you'd gone through those turnstiles, you were the highest you could be in that stadium. Because then the stadium was built into the side of the hill and then the pitch is beneath you. And if you go there today, it's the same setup. You look to the left, back in 85, that's where the cop was, uncovered. Across you had Midland Road. Now, as you look across from the main stand to Midland Road, you can see across the valley, up the other hill to the other side. So it sort of goes down where train lines are and then it goes back up again. So they more or less built this stadium clinging onto the side of that hill. So on the 11th of May 1985, Bradford, for the first time in 56 years, had won a piece of silverware. Now, the Football League in England today, Premiership, Championship, League One, League Two. Back then in 85, it was Division 1, 2, 3 and 4. And Bradford, the week before, had beaten Bolton at Bolton and secured promotion to Division 2, which today is the Championship. And they'd secured it as champions. So it was the first, yeah, like I said before, it was the first thing we'd won in 56 years. 56 years. So the usual attendance back then was 6,000 something. That was the average attendance for Valley Parade. And that day, I think they got just short of 11,000 in. Just got short of 11,000 in that day. And before the kickoff, Peter Jackson were presented with the Division 3 trophy and he lifted it before the game. So everybody were happy. So it was more or less a carnival atmosphere. They were not on the game. Their opposition, Lincoln City, they were mid-table. They weren't going for any promotion. They weren't fighting for survival. And that first half were pretty drab. Now, with Bradford gaining promotion, and it looked like they were going to get promotion from around Christmas because they were stringing these positive results together. So knowing that they were going to have to go up to Division 2, they put in a request to the Football Trust to get a loan out to upgrade the ground because you look back at the ground, you look back at the pictures pre-85, it looks like Eastern Europe. It looks like a ground that you would go to in a non-league Polish team. So they put in a request and they'd been given a grant for £400,000, which in today's money, if you take for inflation, would have been £1,600,000, which is not much really. The steel roof had already been delivered. So as soon as the 90 minutes were done with this Bradford Lincoln game, the bulldozers were coming in and knocking that stand down. And it were going to get rebuilt with a brand new, shiny steel stand. Now, the stand that was there, I mean, the ground had been there since the 1880s. It used to be a rugby stadium, Manningham Rugby Football Club. And then Bradford City took it over, and in 1908 they were in Division 1, so we're in the top division. So they decided to build this stand, and this stand was started in 1908 and it was finished in 1911, and it held about, well, I looked it up and they said 5,300 seated fans and 7,000 standing. I'm not sure if that's true, because that doesn't add up right. Anyway, it were a wooden stand, and it were built into the side of this hill, and it was old and it was Victorian. So 1911 to 85 is is 74 years old. I'm not a mathematician. So yeah, this stand was 74 years old, this old Victorian stand. Okay, now, it only had to last 45 minutes more. That's all it had to last. It didn't have to last 5 or 6 games into the season. It only had to last another 45 minutes, which is the worst thing about this whole tragedy. It wasn't long. It wasn't long until the whole thing would have got knocked down. Yeah, so because we were getting promotion, and because it was such a big thing in Bradford City's history, there were all these foreign dignitaries that had been invited over from our twin towns. So there were people from Verviers in Belgium, and Ham and Mönchengladbach in Germany. So there were foreigners there that had come over to see and join in with this celebration of Bradford City getting promoted. Which, yeah, it was a big thing, especially being starved of any sort of glitter and positivity for so many years. To be going up as champions to Division 1 were a pretty big thing. So everybody that were going were happy. So the trophy were given to Peter Jackson. He raised it, clapping and screaming and shouting. Brilliant, it's done. Let's have a game. So the game was more or less an exhibition game. There were no on it for anybody. No on it for anybody. So people were just getting a run out. They were already on beach. They were done. So the first half kicked off late because of this trophy ceremony. So it kicked off at 4 minutes past 3. And by all, I mean, I wasn't there, but by all accounts, I had school friends that were there, and they said that first half were just backwards and forwards. There were no real chances or anything like that. It was just a boring game. And then around 4:45, the commentator John Elm was sat in the press box above the in Midland Road, stand, which is directly opposite this main stand. And he noticed a fire that had started over on the right hand side, as he was looking at it, on the right hand side of the stand. And you would have heard him at the start of the podcast, that audio that I put on the start of the podcast, or if you watch on YouTube, the visual, the YouTube clip that I put on, you can hear him. Oh, I've just spotted a fire. And that was the first that anybody really knew about it, is when he mentioned it. Now, with that stand being so old, what you had, like I said before, the top of the stand where you came in was the highest part. And it dropped down pretty steep. And you had, I think, 8 rows of seats, 6 or 8 rows of seats where you sat down, and they had risers on. So there was a like a step up, and there were your seat. Then there were a slight wall, and it went down to the next row of seats, which went down at an angle, a lesser angle. So you were just sort of sat on benches. You were sat on benches, and then there were another wall, and it was standing room only. So you had it was a kind of paddock. So, and then to get onto those people stood in that paddock were 2 feet below pitch level. So where you were stood, where your feet were stood, were 2 feet below where the pitch was that you were watching. So that wall in front of those that was stood in the paddock was 5 foot. I mean, today's standards, it's naught but a death trap. But in 1985, I mean, a few of the council had been to check it, and they were saying, "Look, you've got to get this sorted because there's a build-up of rubbish under that stand." Because those seats, with it being made of wood, there were holes in them. And when they'd eat a bag of crisps or they'd have something to eat, and they'd just put the garbage on the floor and kick it under, and it'd go under the stand, and there'd be a big build-up. Peter Jackson was saying when he were an apprentice, the apprentices had to sweep the stands after the game. And rather than get it all bagged up and take it to bins, they'd just find an hole in stand and just sweep it in that hole, and the garbage would go under the stands. So there were a massive build-up of rubbish under that stand. And it wasn't going to need much to go up. So you've got that. You've got all these obstacles to get over if something does happen. So there's 2 of the things that were against everybody that day. Now, in 1985, it wasn't like today. You could smoke everywhere. I mean, up until the 90s, you were able to smoke on aeroplanes. But in 1985, you were smoking in pubs, you were smoking on the bus, you could smoke in shops, in the cinema, you'd smoke everywhere. So having a cig at a football game, nobody batted an eyelid. So you had that. Now you get, if there's a stand of 6,000 people, back then in 85, you'd have at least 500 smokers in there. So when you think about it, how the thing hadn't gone up before is a miracle. So you've got the wooden stand, you've got the build-up of garbage, you've got the absolute assault course that you've got to get over if out goes wrong. And once everybody were in, after about 5 minutes after kickoff, the latecomers would come in So those turnstiles at the top of the stand were all manned. There were people there just for the latecomers, and then about 5 or 10 minutes after kick-off, those doors were shut, so nobody else were getting in. And they were shut and bolted and padlocked, so nobody was sneaking in either. So you had no exits back at stand. There were no way getting out. And just to keep folk from sneaking in. Now, fire extinguishers. When you go to any sort of stadium now, you don't see any wood. No, none of the stands are made of wood anymore. It's all concrete and steel. But there's also fire extinguishers. Now, people have got sense these days. Everybody goes on about kids today, but people have got sense these days not to muck about with fire extinguishers, because they're going to be needed sooner or later. A fire extinguisher will be needed. Back then, in 80s, when hooliganism were at its height, if you had a fire extinguisher and it were kicking off, one of them would be picked up, either set off or used to batter the opposition. So, like with other football teams around the ground, the stadium staff, the owners, the chairman have thought, well, I'm spending a fortune on these fire extinguishers, and they're just getting set off by these hooligans. So the fire extinguishers were taken away. So there were no way of fighting a fire immediately because there were no fire extinguishers. Yeah, so that's another strike against the stadium. And the last one, with this stand being 74 years old, you can imagine the weather that Bradford gets. Raining, cold, windy, occasional sunny weather, but it's mostly rain and wind. So that roof would leak. It would leak a lot. So replacing them timbers became very expensive. So I think a decision must have been made finally just to put a bitumen roof on. So they'd put a layer of felt, a layer of roofing mat over the top, and then they'd just put hot tar all over the roof, which would waterproof it. And there's no water getting through that sort of stuff, which is perfect because it's cheap to install and it works. But if fire hits it, it goes up like a Roman candle and it drips down all that hot tar onto whoever is sitting underneath it. And it's highly flammable. So that's what was in play on May the 11th, 1985. You've got an old stand, an old wooden stand, a build-up, a rubbish understand. You're allowed to smoke. There were no fire extinguishers. The turnstiles at the back of the stand were locked, and there were a bitumen roof right above your head. I mean, if you think of that happening today, they wouldn't be able to shut that stadium down quick enough. They wouldn't. But Bradford City didn't have any money. They'd got this loan and they were going to sort it out at full time. And full time was a half time and a half away. So they had about an hour left of the game. 90 minutes after that fire started, that stadium would have been empty. It would have been empty. And if it had gone up then, well, that's no problem really, is it? Because there's nobody there. So, about 3 rows back from block G, on the right hand side of the stand is where it started. Now, going to Valley Parade, and any fan will tell you who goes to Valley Parade, and John Hendry, who was a player on the day, he said in an interview later, it was a weird day that day because the wind always blew. If you were looking at the stand, the wind always blew from left to right. But that day it was blowing from right to left. And he said, yeah, the players noticed it and it were mentioned that the wind were blowing other way. Now, it just so happens that the fire started on the right side of the stand. If it had started on the left side of the stand, this fire wouldn't have jumped so quick. It wouldn't have jumped so quick. I mean, when you listen to it or watch it, from when John Elm spots that fire up until the whole lot's up, it's 5.5 minutes. 5.5 minutes. The way that it swept through, when you sit down and watch it. Now, John Elm spots it and he says, oh, it's a firing stand. And the police came over and they started clearing it. So one of the policemen shouted to his mate, get a fire extinguisher. Now, there wasn't any. But the policeman that heard him thought he said, call the fire engines. So a call were put in more or less the same time as John Elm saw it. So if you watch it, it starts really quickly and it's so fierce, is this fire. And you see about, I would say, 12 or 15 seats are going up. So all the fans have sort of dispersed and you can see some people walking up to the back, which must have been a bit of a mistake. But because there were a few bodies that were found up there. And some people jumped over the wall and went round to cop, but they were all sort of bunching up towards the right hand side, and then the roof caught, and that bitumen roof caught. Now, with the roof catching, the black smoke, you start to see the black smoke. Now, the thing with that black smoke, it had nowhere to go, because if you looked side on at the stand, it was kind of two roofs. So it looked like an upturned W. So the fire caught the roof. The smoke, because there were two inverted V's, had nowhere to go. So it stuck in the roof. This thick smoke was stuck in the roof. And as more thick smoke hit that roof, unable to escape, it pushed down onto fans underneath. And there were people in that stand that couldn't see a fucking thing in front of them. Never mind getting over all these walls, they couldn't see out. Because this smoke had nowhere to escape. And then when it just got too much, the smoke started barreling out on, first of all, on right side at stand, but then it was working its way across to left where all the fans were trying to get out. And thank God, some of them were overcome by smoke before flames got them, which is a bit of a blessing in disguise, to be honest. If you think about it, if you sort of pass out with smoke, obviously you're not going to be able to breathe, but you're not going to you're not really going to be feeling out when flames come. And I remember seeing it on telly, this thick, billowy smoke. Now, within a minute and a half, that panic, you can see it was just survival of the fittest getting onto pitch. Because they were down there in paddock. Everybody had come, those that hadn't gone to the back had come down over those two walls, and now everybody's in standing room only in paddock. And then they had to get over a 5-foot wall to get onto pitch. And then once they're over that 5-foot wall, there's the advertisement hoardings. Now, what you get today is these digital advertisement hoardings, but what you got back in 85 were kind of like a sandwich board. So you had to get over them. And I mean, there were 3.5 foot, but you still had to get over it. And the heat that was coming off, we were just melting people's jackets. So it was just another obstacle to get over. So you see that if you watch it, you can see a switch when everybody, because everybody were going, they were singing and laughing, and then it caught, and then people just started panicking. Now the police, the police get a lot of grief nowadays, but the police that day, they were running in and grabbing people and pulling them back, running in. They just kept going and kept going. And there were a lot of old people in that stand that day. A lot of people in the 60s, the 70s and the 80s who they don't want to stand up for a full game. I mean, back in 85, we didn't know what we knew now about exercise and nutrition. So those pensioners weren't as fit as pensioners are today. So they were struggling. And you can see on the, out of all the victims, there were 56 victims. 23 of them were over 65. 23 of those fans were over 65 years old. And I would say that's because of the layout of that stand. As a 52-year-old today, and I'm fitter than most 52-year-olds and healthier than more 52-year-olds, I would say I'd be all right getting out of there. But then a 52-year-old today compared to a 52-year-old in 1985, it's a completely different kettle of fish. There were one story I heard. There were a couple, and I forget the name, but I can remember seeing it on Memorial outside. They both got the same surname, and I think they were both in the 70s. But when the fire were put out, this couple were just sat there upright. So they knew the fire were coming, and they thought we're not going to, and they just sat there and let the flames take them. I mean, it's not a nice way to go, but they went together. Anyway, there were people getting out. Everybody's on pitch, and there was still this kind of party atmosphere when you watch it. Everybody's singing, the songs are getting sung, and then people start coming out of the stand on fire. And those fans on the pitch that were watching that, it sort of went a bit quiet then. And as a 14-year-old, the one thing I remember, and I could not believe what I was watching, over in the Holywell Ash end, the away end, so it was the left-hand side at stand, you could tell they were an old fella. The way, I mean, I think he had a flat cap on. But this man was completely on fire. From head to toe, he was completely on fire. And he's just walking at the side of the pitch as if he's walking in a park. He's just walking as if he's taking a stroll in the park with his dog. Obviously, the shock is setting. He doesn't know what's going on. And he is completely on fire. And the cameraman that day zoomed right in on that old fella, just as John Elm is saying, look at that, look at that. And it was just this old fella. And within seconds, the fans, the police, some police had wrestled him to the floor, and the fans were taking off the jackets and just putting them flames out, hitting him with jackets and putting him out. And I think a few days later, they said that he'd passed away in the hospital. He was still alive pitch side. They got him to BRI, and I think he died a few days later. Yeah. Because what had happened that day was we didn't have the want a live feed to this Division 3 game. Nobody would want to watch that. The tape was filmed, and then they got it in a vehicle and got it straight over to Yorkshire Television in Leeds, which is only about 8 or 9 miles away. And by the time the 6 o'clock news came on, obviously that was Leeds Story today, and they showed you it uncensored. So what you see on YouTube at the start of this clip, or what you are hearing on the podcast at the start of this podcast, is what we were seeing in 1985. And I was sat with my mum and dad, and you were just watching this thinking, what, this is my hometown? This is my hometown. So it was shocking. But you didn't think that anybody had died, because they didn't know that anybody had died, because by the time that clip had aired on Yorkshire TV, the fire brigade was still putting out the flames and still damping down, because it were only about an hour after the game, and they'd not done the body count. They'd not done the body count yet, so we didn't know if anybody had died. But when you see that fella walking out on fire, even as a 14-year-old, I was thinking, I can't see anybody surviving that. So you sort of had your fingers crossed. And then as it went on and it went on and it went on, 10 o'clock news, 30, 40. And I'm not sure. I've looked, I've checked on internet, but I think there were 54. By the following morning, I think 54 had died, and there were 2 still hanging on in hospital. And one of them was that fella that walked out on fire. So, yeah, it was shocking. And I remember coming back, because I'd been up in Dales with my parents, and we were coming back on the Sunday, and we always drove past the stadium on the way home, down Manningham Lane. And as we're driving past Valley Parade, you sort of looked down to the left, and you just saw the back of the stadium, and it was grey. It wasn't black. I remember it not being black. It was grey. Yeah, it looked horrible. It looked horrible. Anyway, it turns out that in total 56 people had died. 54 people from Bradford and 2 Lincoln City fans had died. Yeah. So like I said before, 23 of them were 65 or over. 11 of them were under 18. And the rest were between 18 and 65. So it got all ages, but mostly the old ones. The oldest one were 86-year-old. And I'm trying to think. I don't know if they were I don't know if they were an 8-year-old. But I know there were a couple of 11-year-olds. The name, and I know there's other names I'm forgetting, but the name Ormonroyd sticks in my mind, because if you look on the memorial outside, you can see that it's the dad and his 2 kids that have gone to football. And you just know there's a mother at home that has said that morning, take them out from under feet, take them to football, and I'll have tea on when you get home. And they've not gone home. And there's a few families on that memorial that's the same, in the same situation. But the Ormonroyds, I never knew them, but that's the one that always sticks out to me in that list of 56 people. Now there were a girl called Moira Hodgson who I never knew. She went to a different school than me, but we were the same age, and she lived really close to where I lived in Bradford, but I didn't know her. But she lived in Oakenshaw, just over at bridge from where I live in Lowmore. And I remember I knew where the family lived because there were a load of flowers outside the house. I was shown this house by somebody, and they were saying, "Oh yeah, that's one of the people that died in fire." Yeah, but after that disaster, to see the old town and the way it came together, as a 14-year-old, you thought, well, it's not that bad here. If people can come together on that, because what you've got to remember is, it were only 5 years before that Yorkshire Ripper had been caught, and for 9 years he had terrorised that city, killing 13 women. And then Bradford City have got promotion, so it's a bit of colour that's been thrown into the mix. So everybody were happy, and we couldn't even have as positivity without. We had as positivity. It was as if somebody has just gone, "Yeah, there you go. Yeah, just have a taste of it. Just have and just grabbed it away a couple of minutes before half time." I read in the paper, and I don't know who wrote it, but it will always stick with me because I wasn't a big reader then, but I read about it, and it said Bradford were having a fantastic afternoon of football, celebrating promotion to Division 2, and then for one moment, a horseman of the apocalypse just paused for a while on top of a Valley Parade stand. I'll always remember that, and I have no idea who wrote it. I have no idea who wrote that. But it always stuck with me for years and years. That stuck with me. So then after that year was the Popperwell inquiry. And this fella came up from down south. He really wasn't made welcome, because it was just, the way I read it, it was just a posh fella from London that didn't know the city, didn't know the club, didn't know the people, telling us what we already knew had happened. Yeah. Yeah, I remember him not being made that welcome. You see, the thing with Bradford and Bradford people is it's happened. Thank you for your help, but just jog on and we'll deal with it ourselves. We don't want you coming round and interviewing us after. Just leave us be and we'll figure it out ourselves. And that's something that if anything negative happens to me, I just leave me be and I'll sort it out. I say, boy, you need a bit of company. No, you don't. And I think that's what we are as a city. When something horrific happens to us, like the Ripper, the fire, the race riots in 2001, leave us to it. We'll sort it out ourselves. We don't need people from outside coming in. We'll figure it out ourselves. And I think that's a really good thing about the people of Bradford. It really is. Now, be it a good thing with the attitude of people from Bradford, but 2.5 weeks later, Heysel happened. And because that was such a high stakes game, it was Champions League final, Liverpool against Juve, they were fighting in lumps and a wall collapsed and on the Juve fans and killed 39 of them. And this was before kickoff, and they still played the game. The dead bodies on terraces, and they were still playing the game. So the Bradford City Fire got forgotten about very quickly because Liverpool were at their height in '85, Champions League final. So lowly Bradford, that disaster, nobody were talking about it 3 or 4 weeks later, a month after. Nobody were even mentioning it, which is what we would prefer. And then 1989, 15th of April, Hillsborough, Liverpool, again, that disaster in Sheffield, 96 people, you know, you start talking about the Bradford Fire, people will be saying, oh yeah, I remember that. So it were these two disasters in quick succession that kind of put us on the back burner, which, is what I think the people of Bradford would prefer. So yeah, if you ever meet somebody from Bradford and you just ask them the date, they will know it. Now, how this started. So there were a fella, an expat, and he'd flown over from Australia, and his son had sorted out these tickets, and they'd gone to football. And him and his son were there having a coffee, and the dad's having a cig, and he puts the cig out, and the cig rolled before he could put his foot on it. It rolled under the stand. It had gone through an hole and gone into the stand below. And he said, "Oh shit!" Oh, he's thought, "All right," and he's forgotten about it. And then a few minutes later, this smoke starts billowing up, just a small bit of smoke. So the father and son poured a bit of coffee on it, and it said it went out. And then there were people around who think, "Oh, my feet are getting warm here," and that's how it started. It was a discarded cigarette, and this fella, the police came knocking for him, and he said, "Yeah, we tried to pour coffee on it. We alerted the police, and it was just one of them things. Obviously, he wasn't charged, but to have that on your conscience, it must be something. It's something to live with, is that?" But there you go, a serious one this week. But it's all about the Bradford City Fire. And you can find it on YouTube. I will put the YouTube clip below in the description. And you can watch it on YouTube. But yeah, that's my serious one this week. And we'll be back to normal next week. Thank you all for subscribing and thank you all for the downloads. And I'll see you next time. Bradford are playing Carlisle this weekend in the playoff semi-final. Go for it. Let's get into League One. Thank you. See you next week.